The town of Ashford was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, where secrets rarely stayed hidden for long, and where gossip traveled faster than the wind that bent the trees along its dirt roads. Yet for nearly 3 decades, there was one secret that no one dared to speak aloud. At the center of it stood a woman named Eliza, the town's midwife. To most, she was a figure of necessity, the one every expectant mother turned to when the pains of childbirth came too soon or too strong. She carried with her the tools of her trade: herbs in little glass jars, cloth wraps, and a leather bag that smelled faintly of blood and vinegar. Her face was stern, her voice soft, and her hands, they said, never trembled, no matter how difficult the birth. In a time when medicine was primitive and hospitals were hours away, Eliza was indispensable. Women trusted her, husbands respected her, and the town looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and quiet unease. Babies were born in Ashford by her hands, but strangely they never seemed to grow up there. Families who had announced a pregnancy, with joy, were seen weeks later dressed in black, their eyes hollow, their arms empty. Others whispered of infants who had been taken away suddenly, sent to relatives far off, though no letters ever arrived to confirm it. The pattern was so steady, so consistent that outsiders might have seen it clearly. But in Ashford, where suspicion was dangerous and survival often meant silence, no one asked too many questions. Eliza lived on the edge of town in a house that leaned slightly to one side, its shutters always closed, its chimney forever smoking. Children dared one another to creep near her garden, but none stayed long, for the air carried strange scents: sharp herbs, bitter roots, and the faint metallic tang of iron. Dogs would not cross her fence. The few who had been inside spoke of walls lined with shelves of bottles, jars that seemed to hold shapes just beyond recognition, and a cellar door that was always locked tight with a heavy iron clasp. The first true suspicions began when the Harland family lost their child. Sarah Harland had gone into labor on a bitter winter night, and Eliza had been called. She arrived swiftly, her lantern cutting through the snow, her breath clouding the air. Hours later, Eliza emerged with her usual calm, announcing that the child had not survived. But neighbors who had gathered swore they had heard a baby cry, not once, but several times. And yet, when asked, Eliza said nothing. She returned to her home, leaving behind a mother whose eyes stared endlessly at the empty cradle by her bedside. The Harland case was not the first, nor would it be the last. Over the years, more families suffered the same fate. Birth announced. With hope, labor endured with pain, a baby's cry heard in the night, and then silence. Each time, Eliza bore the news of loss with the same stillness, her eyes dark and unreadable. She offered condolences, sometimes a small vial of sleeping, tonic for the mother's grief, and then she left. Some whispered that Eliza was cursed, that death followed her like a shadow. Others whispered darker things still, that she was not a midwife at all, but a thief of life, a woman who fed something inhuman with the children she delivered. The turn of the century, the town had grown used to the pattern, as though grief were simply part of life in Ashford. But buried beneath that resignation lay fear, a fear that spread slowly and silently, until it became part of the air itself. And yet Eliza remained. Her hair turned gray, her back stooped. But she still walked the streets with her leather bag, still entered homes when the time came, still left with the same quiet announcement of loss. No one ever saw her bury a child. No one ever saw her carry one away. But the fact remained. Every baby she delivered vanished from the world. It might have continued indefinitely had it not been for a single discovery one autumn evening. A boy named Peter Winslow, no more than 12, had been chasing a stray chicken near Eliza's home. The bird darted through a gap in her fence, and Peter, desperate not to lose it, followed. As he drew closer to the leaning house, He heard something that froze him in place, the faint wail of an infant coming from beneath the ground. It was muffled, distorted, but unmistakable. He crept closer, pressing his ear to the cold stone wall near the cellar. Again, the cry rose, then fell silent. Peter fled, abandoning the chicken, his legs carrying him faster than he had ever run. He told his mother what he had heard, his words tumbling out in terror. She hushed him quickly, warning him never to repeat it, not if he valued his life. But children cannot always keep secrets, and soon others heard the tale. Within days, the whispers spread. Some scoffed, some shivered, but all felt the weight of something long suspected. The cellar in Eliza Marrow's home was not a place of storage. It was a place of keeping. That winter, no one called for Eliza when a woman went into labor. They sent instead for a doctor from the next county, enduring the long wait, the perilous ride through snow and ice, rather than let the midwife cross their threshold. For the first time in decades, Eliza was excluded from the most sacred of duties. Her shutters remained closed, her smoke rising steady, but no lanterns passed her path at night. It was as though the town had silently agreed to cut her away, like a diseased limb from a body. Yet Eliza did not protest. She did not leave. She simply stayed in her home, her presence looming like a shadow that refused to vanish. And though no births were entrusted to her that year, the sounds from beneath her cellar did not cease. On still nights when the wind carried just right, some claimed they could hear the faint cries of children drifting on the air, mingling with the smoke that curled from her chimney. The town's silence could not last forever. A secret that old, that heavy, eventually demands to be faced. And when it did, the truth behind Eliza Marrow and her vanished children would prove far darker than anyone dared to imagine. The decision to confront Eliza Marrow came not in a meeting hall, not through an official decree, but in the dark corners of taverns and around kitchen tables where whispers carried more weight than law. For years, the townspeople of Ashford had avoided the truth, pretending not to see the trail of grief left in Eliza's wake. But now the cries that children claimed to hear beneath her cellar had given voice to what everyone already feared. Silence, they realized, was no longer safety. It was complicity. It was the Harlans who spoke first, their sorrow still raw after so many years. Others followed, emboldened by drink or by grief of their own. Families who had buried empty coffins, who had mourned babies that vanished like smoke, found themselves admitting what they had long denied, that Eliza's presence in Ashford was a curse. Still, none were brave enough to face her openly. To accuse a woman who had delivered nearly every child in town was to invite a kind of madness, as though the very act of naming her crimes would make them undeniable. But fear does strange things to a community. By the spring thaw, small acts of resistance began. A stone thrown at her shutter, a crude mark painted on her fence. Children spat on the ground when they passed her gate, though they never lingered long. The minister, once careful to avoid her name from the pulpit, began to speak more freely of sin and corruption, of wolves dressed as lambs among the flock. His words, though never direct, fell heavy on ears eager for direction. And yet Eliza did not respond. She did not emerge to protest, nor did she attempt to ingratiate herself with the town. She continued her routines as though nothing had changed, tending to her garden, smoke curling steady from her chimney. On nights when no wind stirred, neighbors swore they saw her standing in the upstairs window, her figure tall and motionless, her face obscured by darkness. She watched them, they said. She counted them, one by one. The tension reached its breaking point with the death of young Mary Collins. Barely 17, she had gone into labor too early, her body frail, her cries echoing through her family's farmhouse. The doctor from the next county had been sent for, but the roads were blocked by spring floods, and by the time he arrived, both mother and child were gone. The Collins family buried their daughter in a storm of grief, and though Eliza had not been called, her name was on every tongue. If she had been there, some muttered bitterly, the girl might have lived. Others snapped back that Mary would only have joined the endless list of vanished children. The town had split down the center, between those who still clung to Eliza as a necessary evil and those who wanted her cast out forever. It was then that Thomas Harland, Sarah's husband and father of the lost child years before, resolved to act. He gathered a small group of men, each with their own silent claim against the midwife, each carrying lanterns and tools that might serve as weapons. On a damp night when the moon was hidden by clouds, they walked together to Eliza Marrow's house. The air grew thick as they neared her gate, as though the earth itself resisted their approach. Dogs howled from far-off farms. A wind rose suddenly, carrying with it the bitter smell of her herbs. But they pressed on, their boots sinking into the soft ground, their eyes fixed on the leaning silhouette of the house. When they reached the door, they found it unlocked, as though she had been expecting them. Inside, the air was colder than the night outside. The walls were lined with shelves of jars, just as the children had whispered. Some held dried plants, others cloudy liquids, but many contained things that turned the stomach. Curled shapes suspended in yellow brine, fragments of bone too small to belong to animals. The men tried not to look, focusing instead on the narrow staircase that led to the cellar below. The iron clasp that had always held the cellar shut was gone. In its place, the door stood slightly ajar, and from the darkness below drifted the sound that froze them in place. A baby's cry. Soft at first, then louder, wavering, then echoing until the walls themselves seemed to vibrate with it. It was not the cry of one child, but of many. A chorus of voices, rising and falling, pleading and wailing in unison. Thomas Harland lifted his lantern, his face pale with dread, and pushed the door open. The men descended one by one, the steps groaning beneath their weight. The air grew damp, heavy with the smell of rot and iron. At the bottom, their lantern light revealed the truth. The cellar was vast, far larger than the footprint of the house, above. Its walls had been carved deeper into the earth, lined with shelves and alcoves. On those shelves rested dozens of small bundles wrapped in cloth, stacked like firewood. Some were fresh, damp with stains that glistened in the light. Others were ancient, crumbling, their fabric eaten by time. Between them sat jars filled with strange fluids, within which tiny forms floated, twisted, unmoving, yet unmistakably human. The men recoiled, horror gripping them, but the cries did not stop. They came not from the bundles or the jars, but from the earth itself, from cracks in the stone floor as though the ground beneath their feet was alive with suffering. Thomas knelt, pressing his hand to the dirt, and felt a vibration, faint, pulsing, like the heartbeat of something buried. Then they heard another sound, footsteps, slow and steady, descending the stairs. Eliza Marrow appeared in the lantern, glow, her face calm, her hands folded before her. She looked at the men with eyes that seemed older than the earth itself, eyes that held no surprise, no fear, only inevitability. The cries rose to a fever pitch, shaking the shelves, rattling. The jars, one shattered, spilling its contents onto the stone. The men stumbled back, their courage faltering, for they realized in that moment that whatever dwelled in the cellar was not simply Eliza's doing. It was something far older, something she had served rather than created. The lanterns flickered as though a great breath had passed through the room, and when the light steadied again, Eliza Marrow was gone, vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only the endless cries that clawed at the walls. The men fled, their torches barely holding against the suffocating darkness. By the time they reached the surface, the night air felt thin and unreal, the town beyond strangely distant. None spoke of what they had seen, none dared. But from that night onward, Ashford was no longer a place of quiet ignorance. The truth of Eliza's cellar had seeped into their bones, and there would be no turning away. The men who had entered Eliza Marrow's house swore an oath that night, an oath of silence born not from loyalty, but from terror. They stumbled back to their homes, pale and trembling, faces hollow as though they had left a part of themselves, in the cellar beneath her floorboards. Their wives pressed them for answers, but the words caught in their throats. How could they describe what they had seen without sounding mad? Worse still, how could they admit that they had fled, leaving the thing or things beneath that house to continue as it pleased? But silence does not erase truth. In Ashford, silence had become an infection, seeping from one household to another until the entire town was sick with it. Children noticed their fathers waking from nightmares drenched in sweat, their eyes wild, with images they could not name. Mothers caught their husbands sitting awake at dawn, staring at the window as though expecting something to appear on the other side. None admitted the cause aloud, yet everyone sensed it. The cellar had marked them. The change in the town was slow at first, then sudden. Livestock began to vanish, not stolen but seemingly erased. Horses were found wandering without harness, their riders gone. Dogs whined at doors and refused to walk the roads that led past Eliza's house. Infants grew restless, waking in the night screaming as if something unseen had brushed against their cribs. And through it all, Eliza herself remained unbothered, her garden blooming lush even in weeks of drought, her shutters open as if inviting them to look. The minister, unable to contain his own fear, broke the silence in a sermon that thundered through the small wooden church. He spoke of rot in the foundation of Ashford, of sins buried deep that cried for reckoning. Though he never named her, every soul in the room turned their thoughts to Eliza Marrow. For the first time, whispers rose not of avoidance but of action. If the law could not help them, if no sheriff would believe tales of jars and cries from the earth, then the burden fell on them. It was Thomas Harlan's wife, Sarah, who pushed the town past fear into desperation. She had been ill since that night her husband returned from Eliza's cellar, her body wasting though no sickness could be found. One evening, she collapsed, her lips blue, her chest rising only in shallow breaths. The doctor could do nothing but shake his head. In her fever, she muttered the name Eliza again and again, her voice breaking into sobs. To the Harlans, the meaning was clear. The midwife had claimed her just as she had claimed their child. When Sarah died before dawn, the town reached its breaking point. The funeral was hushed, grief and fury braided together in every bowed head. Afterward, Thomas Harland did not weep. He stood before the mourners with his jaw clenched and his eyes burning, and he swore that his wife's soul would not be another taken into Eliza's grasp. He would see the midwife driven from Ashford or buried beneath it. The men who had once fled from her cellar gathered again, this time joined by others whose fear had hardened into rage. They carried tools of destruction, axes, ropes, and barrels of oil. Women and children stayed behind their doors, watching through cracks as the men marched with lanterns toward the crooked house at the edge of town. Some prayed, others cursed, but none doubted what would come. When they reached the house, they found Eliza waiting on her porch. She did not hide. She did not run. Her eyes gleamed in the firelight, calm as still water. She said nothing. Yet, the air seemed to shudder with her presence. The men hesitated, their fury wavering beneath the weight of her silence. It was Thomas who stepped forward, his voice breaking as he shouted for her to leave Ashford, to take whatever darkness she had bound herself to and carry it away. Eliza did not move. Instead, a sound rose from the earth. faint at first, then swelling until it seemed to roll beneath their feet, the cries of infants, dozens of them, wailing in chorus. Some men clapped their hands over their ears, others stumbled back in horror. But Thomas pressed on, raising his lantern high and shouting, "For the oil." They would burn her out, cellar and all, and seal the evil beneath the ashes. The first torch struck the side of the house, flames licking across the dry wood. Another followed, then another, until the night glowed with fire. Smoke curled upward, sparks dancing into the black sky. Yet Eliza did not flinch. She stood in the doorway as the flames closed around her, her pale face illuminated like a mask. For a moment, it seemed as though the fire itself bowed to her, bending away instead of consuming. Then the earth split. A crack tore through the foundation, splitting the porch boards, knocking men from their feet. From below came not only cries but voices, layered, pleading, shrieking, overlapping until they formed a terrible harmony. The ground shook, lanterns shattered, and the fire roared higher, drawn not by wind but by something deeper, hungrier. The men fled again, stumbling into the fields as the house was swallowed by light and smoke. By dawn, nothing remained but a smoldering pit where the house had stood. No sign of Eliza was ever found. No bones, no ashes, nothing. The cellar had collapsed, its secrets buried once more. The men returned to their families, claiming victory, telling themselves the evil had been destroyed. But none could forget the cries that had risen from the earth, cries that had not stopped even as the house burned. In the weeks that followed, Ashford grew quieter. Crops bloomed again, livestock returned to their pens, and children slept soundly, for the first time in years. But beneath that fragile calm lay unease, for the men who had lit the flames carried their silence like chains. They knew, deep in their marrow, that Eliza had not perished. She had simply gone deeper. The ground itself had taken her in, and the town rested on soil that was no longer theirs. And then, one by one, the children of Ashford began to vanish. Not in their cribs this time, not from their mother's arms. They disappeared in the daylight, snatched from doorsteps, pulled from yards, wandering from paths they had walked 100 times. No sound preceded their vanishings. No figure was seen. Only absence, spreading like a stain, until every family once more knew loss. At night, when the wind blew from the fields, their cries returned. Not from the burned pit, but from the ground beneath every home. The fire that consumed Eliza Marrow's house became a story told in hushed voices, a cautionary tale of how Ashford had once risen against the evil that dwelled among them. Yet as the smoke cleared and weeks stretched into months, it became increasingly clear that the flames had not been a cleansing. They had been an opening. What the townspeople thought they had destroyed was only released. At first, it seemed contained. The disappearances continued within Ashford, children slipping away in broad daylight, leaving no trace but the echo of their laughter still hanging in the air. Mothers clutched their remaining little ones, fathers barred doors and nailed windows, shut. Yet none of it mattered. Whatever force Eliza had bound herself to did not need doors or windows. It moved beneath the ground, through roots and soil, reaching up like unseen fingers to pluck the innocent away. Families grew smaller, grief pressing down on them like a suffocating fog. But then the horror spread. A family traveling through Ashford on their way west lost their infant while resting at an inn. The child had been laid in a cradle beside the bed, but by morning the blankets were empty. The parents, distraught, accused the innkeeper of theft, but the man swore he had done nothing. Word traveled with the grieving family, and soon other towns spoke of the midwife of Ashford, of the cursed soil where babies disappeared without a sound. The story grew legs, stretching beyond county lines, carried by whispers along trade routes and riverboats. Farmers in neighboring towns began to report strange disturbances, fields where the ground seemed to pulse, where crops withered overnight, though the soil was rich and moist. Travelers swore they heard the cries of children carried on the wind as they passed near Ashford's borders. Those who dared to stay a night in the region woke with the impression of tiny hands pressing against their windows, smudges left behind though no one had been outside. Ashford itself became hollow, a shell of the town it once was. Families fled, taking their surviving children with them, leaving homes abandoned and churches empty. Businesses shuttered, the forge grew cold, and the fields went untended. By the turn of the next decade, only a handful of families remained. Stubborn, desperate souls who believed their roots ran deeper than any curse. But even they learned that roots mean little when the earth itself turns against you. Thomas Harland, once the loudest voice for vengeance, was among those who stayed. His face had aged decades in a handful of years, and his eyes carried a permanent vacancy. His wife and child were gone, and though his body remained, it was as though his spirit had been hollowed out with them. He wandered the abandoned streets at night, lantern in hand, muttering that he would find Eliza, that he would drag her from the soil with his own hands if he had to. Some said they saw him kneeling at the burned ruins of her house, clawing at the dirt until his nails bled. Then one night, Thomas vanished as well. His lantern was found still burning beside the pit, its glass smudged with soot. His footprints circled the ruin again and again before stopping abruptly, as though the earth had swallowed him whole. From that night on, no one in Ashford doubted that Eliza still walked among them, not above ground, but beneath it, woven into the soil, spreading her reach further with every passing year. Travelers who passed near Ashford in the following decades wrote of a strange stillness, a weight in the air that pressed down on the chest and made it hard to breathe. Some recorded in journals that they heard weeping coming from empty houses or laughter echoing in abandoned barns. One man, a preacher heading west, claimed that in the moonlight he saw figures of children standing in a field, their faces pale and eyes empty. When he approached, they sank into the ground as though it were water. By the early 1900s, Ashford was no longer marked on maps. The land was avoided, its roads overgrown, its houses collapsing in on themselves. Those who owned property there could not sell it, for no buyer would dare take it. Nature reclaimed what it could, but even the trees grew twisted, their branches reaching downward as though dragged by invisible weight. Hunters reported animals born deformed, calves with too many limbs, birds with human-like cries, and still, the stories spread. Mothers far from Ashford warned their children of the midwife, telling them to be home before dark lest Eliza take them. The tale became folklore, a ghost story shared around firesides, stripped of detail but heavy with dread. Few believed she was real anymore, not in the new century of trains and electric lights. Yet those who had blood ties to Ashford never laughed when her name was spoken. They carried the knowledge that some roots cannot be cut, some curses do not die with fire. The land itself bore witness. On stormy nights, lightning illuminated the ruins where Eliza's house once stood. Those brave enough to watch swore they saw the silhouette of a woman in the doorway, her figure untouched by flame or rain. And beneath the thunder, faint but undeniable, came the cries of children, hundreds of them, weeping in unison, bound to the woman who had delivered them not into life, but into whatever lay beyond it. As the years turned to decades, Ashford became a legend of its own, a place avoided, unspoken, erased from memory except in whispers. But curses are not bound by borders. Children vanished in nearby towns, their parents insisting they had only looked away for a moment. Farms failed without reason. Strangers went missing on empty roads. Each time, the locals shook their heads and muttered of Eliza, of the midwife who fed the earth with innocence and sorrow. The truth was more terrifying than even the whispers suggested. Eliza Marrow had not died in the flames, nor had she been swallowed by the pit. She had been transformed. She had become one with the very soil of Ashford, her essence spreading beneath the roots and rivers, stretching like veins through the earth itself. And wherever her influence reached, so too did the hunger that drove her. By the time the world marched into modernity, Eliza was no longer just a story. She was a shadow in the ground, a whisper in the wind, a curse that outlived the town that once trusted her. By the middle of the 20th century, Ashford had become little more than a ghost story. Children in neighboring towns dared each other to bike past its borders. Adults spoke of it only in warnings, and maps marked the region with nothing but blank space. What had once been a living town was now a scar on the land. Its houses collapsed, its church bells silent, its graveyards overgrown and nameless. Yet silence is never truly empty. The ground beneath Ashford still stirred with what had been buried, and those who lingered too long could feel it breathing. The modern world, with its cars and radios and endless wars, had little patience for legends. But even progress could not erase the hunger tied to the soil. Surveyors came in the 1950s, seeking to reclaim the land for farming, and within weeks, 2 of them vanished. Their equipment was found in the tall grass, their notebooks torn, but no trace of the men themselves. Others who visited wrote in journals about losing time, about wandering through fields only to emerge hours later with no memory of where they had been. Some claimed they heard children calling their names in voices too familiar, as if their own sons and daughters were trapped in the earth beneath them. By the 1970s, Ashford was a place researchers visited not for farmland, but for folklore, paranormal. Investigators brought tape recorders and cameras, setting them on the ruins of Eliza Marrow's home. The recordings captured faint cries in the background, whispers that grew louder when played backward, voices begging not for release, but for silence. A few investigators never returned. The ones who did carried eyes sunken with dread, swearing never to step foot in Ashford again. But it was not only those who sought the town who felt Eliza's reach. Families in distant states began reporting the same strange phenomena that had plagued Ashford more than a century before. Infants who vanished from locked nurseries, mothers who heard cries from beneath their floors, fathers who dug in their yards to find nothing but damp earth smelling faintly of iron. Each case was explained, away by police and skeptics, yet the pattern was undeniable. Wherever the soil had been carried, in shipments of lumber, in stone used to build new homes, in crops sold from county to county, Eliza's curse traveled too. She was no longer bound to Ashford. She was seeded in the very veins of the land, spreading wherever human hands carried her. By the early 2000s, Ashford itself was almost forgotten, erased by time and nature. But the legend endured in stories passed between families, in whispers traded at campfires, in the quiet dread of mothers who rocked their babies at night and prayed no unseen hands would reach for them. Even those who laughed at such fears found themselves shuddering when their children woke screaming without reason, pointing at the floorboards as though something moved beneath them. The most chilling reports came not from the ruins of Ashford, but from brand new homes built on untouched land hundreds of miles away. Parents described hearing voices in the walls, lullabies sung in tones both soothing and sinister. They spoke of babies who cried as though in answer to another unseen child, only to fall silent all at once, their small faces frozen in terror. And always, when the stories reached those who knew the legend, one name was whispered: Eliza. What Eliza Marrow had become was no longer human, no longer bound by age or death. She was a presence, a hunger that clung to the earth like a root system spreading without end. She had begun as a midwife, trusted with the most sacred of duties, and in her hands that trust had become perverted, twisted into something the world could not contain. Every child she delivered had been taken into that hunger, bound to it, their voices eternally crying from beneath the soil. Now more than a century after her house was reduced to ash, the cries have not stopped. They echo in recordings, they bleed into dreams, they surface in the stillness between thunder and lightning. Those who claim to have heard them say it is not only children anymore, but adults too, their voices pleading from underground, begging to be remembered, begging to be free, yet freedom never comes. Eliza does not release what she takes. The earth of Ashford still lies there, tangled with roots and ruins, covered by weeds and silence. To the unknowing, it looks no different from any other forgotten town reclaimed by time. But those who stand on that soil know better. They feel the weight pressing upward, the restless shifting beneath their feet. They hear, if they listen closely, the faint wail of a newborn carried on the wind. And sometimes, on nights when the moon is thin and the air is still, they see her. A figure in the distance, carrying a lantern, moving slowly across the ruins. Her shape is stooped, her hair silver, her hands clasping the leather bag she always carried. She stops at the burned-out pit, kneels, and vanishes into the ground as though the earth itself opens for her. No one follows. No one dares. Because everyone who knows the story understands one truth. Eliza Marrow was never defeated. She was never destroyed. She waits. She listens. And when the time comes, she delivers. Her children are still out there, crying in the soil, and she will never stop until every last one has been claimed.